Let's be friends.
Have you not?
Here we go. What it is, the Ambassador, bringing you a brand new episode of the Ultra Retro Podcast here on the Ambassadorial Wing. Excuse me. And for those of you that follow this channel, follow this particular series, I hope you enjoy today's edition. And today, in honor of Veterans Day, this being November, obviously, Veterans Day was a few weeks ago, obviously, but today we're going to be covering a that doesn't celebrate or glorify war or the men who fought in it, but it examines a very notable yet at times controversial historical figure, that being, of course, General George S. Patton Jr. And this film, as I said, came out at a time in America when we were in the midst of the latter years of the Vietnam conflict, the Vietnam War. And that is important. That is important context for this movie because the lead actor, of course, being George C. Scott, was a member of the peace movement at the time. He was very anti-war, and he had issues playing this part because, well, Patton, obviously, George Patton was a renowned general during World War II, renowned for his part he played in World War II, particularly in Northern Africa, in Sicily, and obviously in Europe, after D-Day, and also his actions after the end of World War II, particularly in Europe. What this movie does is it presents a human face to this very, at times controversial, but very notable and at times complex individual. You may or may not know is a real person. This isn't just a fictional character, obviously. This is by means a biopic. It used biopics done in cinema. And the original screenplay, funny enough, was actually written by a very noteworthy, at times controversial director and screenwriter, Mr. Francis Ford Coppola. For those you may know the name, I've reviewed a few of his movies in the past. Most notably, of course, was Bram Stoker's Dracula. But Coppola actually wrote the original screenplay for this movie. Now, obviously, he wasn't even at the time. Another screenwriter was brought in to kind of refine the original screenplay that Coppola had penned. But if you own this movie or if you don't own this movie and you want to hear Coppola's thoughts on the film, I would encourage listen to Yellow Commentary because he does give some at times very insightful discussion on the film and the part he played. Granted, it was many years prior to the film actually being directed. But a few notes about the movie itself. It did come out in 1970, as I mentioned, in the waning years of America's involvement in the Vietnam War. And what this movie presents is Patton's involvement in the campaign in Northern Africa against the German General Erwin Rommel. It also depicts his involvement in the invasion of Sicily after that event, and some of the actions that were taken by him and his the other generals that worked alongside him and the other officers as well. In particular, I want to make note of is, of course, Carl Malden, which might not be a familiar name to those of you who are maybe of the younger generations, as of course George C. Scott. Scott has had a very good career in Hollywood. He was a very well-respected, well-liked actor. You can look up his bio on IMDb. I might actually include the link down in the description of this video. But the thing I would encourage you, if you've never seen this movie, go into this with an open mind because this is a film that comes from a different era, from a different time period of filmmaking. What they seek to do in this movie is not paint Patton in a inauthentic picture. It shows his flaws, it shows his good points, it shows all aspects of his personality and his demeanor as a officer in the United States Army. And he was very much a standout in a lot of ways. He went to West Point, obviously being a general. He also went to the Virginia Military Academy, in obviously in Virginia, and and mentioned one of the main lead actors and everything. One of the cast members is of course Carl Malden, who plays the real life General Omar Bradley. Now, had a at times rocky relationship, but they both had respect for one another. And in this movie, you do get a sense of the very congenial, but at times very strained relationship that Patton and Bradley had. Not to mention um, the strained relationship Patton had with other generals, uh, or British military. He was one of the main generals military during World War II. Now, what this movie also presents is some of the eccentricity of his personality when it came to. In one scene in particular, he's talking to one of his aides, and he says, "If it were up to me, I would send a invitation to Erwin Rommel in iambic pentameter, which is a form of poetry, inviting him to a one-on-one tank battle. Me and my tank, he and his, he and our, him and his, and our war, stock and barrel, particularly the war in Europe." And his subordinate, his aide says, "That's history. It's not part of the 20th century." Because interesting fun fact about it was a um, and he didn't necessarily. He was very true. Had trained under him, came and what Patton expected, and he more than what he was able to give, what he was willing to give himself in terms of military service. He was a military man, a family man. He was married. He died shortly before he passed on. I'll get into a little bit later on in the review. But what this movie gives us, which I have not already listed, is it gives us a fairly authentic, if not somewhat exaggerated, portrayal of who George Patton was. It's on Fair, and so a officer, how they're supposed to behave. Also, one of the other interesting is about what he every pardon me, Lord, every goddamn day. But he also had a very strong in past lives and reincarnation. He believed that he had various lives where he was a field Indians. He've been studying past military history to understand how to fight in the current era in which he was active, obviously World War II. He was a reader of philosophy and poetry. He wrote his own poetry, and he even quotes a piece of it in one particular scene. And he, after he's done reciting the piece, he asks the person that he's reciting it to, I believe it was General Omar it was General Bradley. He's like, "You know who the poet was?" And Bradley shakes his head and he's like, "It was me." As I said, Patton was somewhat eccentric, and what you see in this movie is a bit of that eccentricity. But what you also see is his drive to be the best possible officer and soldier that he can be. And he does tolerate what we now come to know as PTSD or combat fatigue, which was what was known as back in the 1940s and 50s. There is one notable scene. This is actually a real life event where he does, in fact, slap the helmet off of a soldier who is in the infirmary for wounded soldiers, who's sitting on a spine because he can't take the shelling and the shock and horror of war any further. And Patton ends up slapping him. Now, this got incredible with the higher ups, particularly um, the leadership of the United States military, that being Dwight D. Eisenhower. He was in after that event and after they got done with the invasion of Sicily, and that was successful, to England and used as a decoy. And he was put up in housing around England that he would consider less than appropriate for a officer of his stature. But in a way, he was being reprimanded, and I would say very harshly so reprimanded for his actions in slapping that soldier. Directed by Eisenhower and several of the other generals and officers that were in charge of the military operations during World War II, to apologize, not to just the soldier that he slapped, but also to all of the patients, the hospital staff, and the doctors that were present when he did so, and to the army that he was in charge of as a whole. And he did it, and he did it somewhat tongue in cheek, but he did not shirk from the fact that he was told to do something by a superior officer. He did it. He may not have liked it, but he did it. And I think that's one of the other aspects about Patton that I myself appreciate. I mean, I have studied his outside of the movie. I have studied his tactics. I've studied his personal life. I've read up on his bibliography or his biography of his life before the war and after and during. And he was very much a family man. He was hard. He was tough, but he was, by all measures, a loving husband and father. He by no means was gruff with his family and everything. Although I can imagine if one of the Patton kids stepped out of line, well, Daddy probably reprimanded them for it. But what we see with this movie is the rise during the war, his decline to a degree, then his resurgence once once the D-Day invasion is carried off and is successful, and his work to take back occupied Europe, France, and the other countries that the conquered during their occupation. And you see him at times very gruff and austere, but necessarily so. And at times you see him with his soldiers, with his troops, and with other troops being very jovial as well. And there's one scene in particular that I want to point out. He's riding in his Jeep with his aide and his driver, and there is a bit of a traffic jam at a country road. It's a rather muddy, soggy country road, and you've got two or three intersections, and they're bottled. The problem is several of the vehicles have gotten stuck, and Patton, being the go-getter and the problem solver that he is, gets out of the Jeep, walks up in through all that mud. He's like, okay, guys, let's get this mess straightened out. And yeah, he's kind of gruff with it, but he's not badgering the soldier. And they finally get the mess cleared up, and one of the other generals, specifically Mark Bradley, shows up, and he goes up to he has one of Bradley's takes over for Patton, And he tells Patton, "You know what, George? You have made a good traffic cop." And it's a couple scenes later, and everything, that it's after in the aftermath of a very fierce and very intense battle between a couple of American units and a couple of German military units. Patton rides up in his Jeep and is overlooking the aftermath. You see bodies strewn everywhere. You see vehicles and tanks from both sides burning or destroyed. Say against this beautiful backdrop of these green hills and this green valley that they're all in. And one of the soldiers is actually still alive, but he's sitting up against his tank tread. And Patton walks up to him and he's like, "What happened?" He's like, "We ran out of gas and we had to fight it out." And Patton leans down, puts his hand on the soldier's shoulder, and then kisses him on the forehead because he respects his commitment to what was done there, to that battle in particular. Now, as the movie goes on, obviously the war in Europe is successful. We between the Americans, the British, and the Russians, the Nazis are defeated. But there is a bit of a falling out between Patton and some of the American officers, because the Americans are trying to play nice with the Russians, even though we did not have the best of relationship with the Russian army during World War II, but did regard them as allies. And this ultimately leads to Patton being relieved of duty altogether. And a reporter asks him, "Are you going to be sent to the Pacific?" And he's like, "Nope." I don't think Dwight MacArthur or Doug MacArthur wants me over there. And Douglas MacArthur himself was very much a very controversial figure as well during World War II and even during the Korean conflict, the Korean War. If I recall correctly, there was a movie done about MacArthur. I think it starred Gregory Peck. If I am to look that up, I'll post it on one of my socials, either on Instagram or X, and everything, so y'all can check out that movie as well. One of the other things I want to remark on about this movie is the authenticity to detail. The tanks, the uniforms, the settings, all are accurate to the period, to the time. The American tanks, the Shermans, were authentic to the time. The German tanks and so on were authentic to the time. The uniforming and everything obviously was authentic to the time. The weaponry and so on was authentic. One other aspect of the film that I really appreciated, and this was added in later after Francis Coppola's involvement, was the introduction of a fictionalized German officer who is a biographer on Patton. And you see during Patton's march through Europe and everything, the liberation of Europe, you see the officer names, I believe the officer's name was Steiger, and he starts tallying the dead, the wounded, and the missing German officers as Patton is in operation in Europe, and the numbers keep going up and up and up and up, telling you that obviously Patton's being very successful, which was why he was brought in the first place. The other aspect of this movie is, of course, the score. This movie has a very iconic score. Um, it's been used to parody Patton in other films and so on. For those of you that were a kid of the 80s or 90s, um, that piece of music was used in an episode of The Simpsons where um, Bart is going to war against Nelson Muntz, and he actually Bart actually slaps one of the other kids that's in his army, and Grandpa Simpson, Abraham Simpson, says, "You apologize to the boy." And he's like, "Why?" He's like, "Well, you can march them till they drop. You can drag them up to some godforsaken battlefield and expect them to die, but for some reason, you can't slap them." And Bart, of course, does indeed slap him, and of course, that is an homage to um, the incident with Patton slapping the soldier in the movie, obviously, and as I mentioned, was actually happened in real life. But the thing I want to leave you all with in regards to this movie is this: this movie is not a glorification of war, much less the individual that is being presented in it. Patton was human, a some would say a remarkable individual. Controversial, yes, but many remarkable individuals in history have at times been controversial. And I would say that's no less true of George S. Patton. So if you've never seen this movie before, I would encourage you to do so. It is a worth your time to check out. If you've watched this movie before, leave your thoughts down below. Let me know what y'all thought of it. And if you haven't watched it in a while, give it a watch. And I want to say, just as a closing note, to all of my friends out there on YouTube, on social media, in my own life, whether you're my friend, whether you're just a fellow collaborator, if you served in this nation's military, I may not do this perfectly, but I salute you most sincerely. As the grandson, the great grandson of a veteran of veterans, I appreciate and I respect your service. And I know what you all went through was not by any means easy. But as the grandson and great grandson of veterans, I myself thank you. So, with all that being said, folks, I hope you all enjoyed this video. As always, make sure you hit that like button, share this out with all your friends on social media, on X or Instagram or Facebook or wherever you happen to operate in social media or on the internet just in general. And as I like to say before I close out, stay ambassadorial. Be honest, be sincere, be yourself. Never take yourself too seriously. If you do all those things, you'll always have a place in the ambassadorial wing. Until next time, this is the ambassador signing off.